April 1987. For 3 days, police and Republicans clashed on the streets of Belfast over an IRA funeral. But the battle lines weren't as clear as they seemed. Not everyone working for the security forces was in uniform. Freddie Scappaticci was at the very heart of the IRA, their spy catcher, the key man responsible for protecting the IRA from informers. But he was also a British Army agent. Others in the crowd were also agents, and the IRA's problem with spies and security breaches was about to deepen. The organisation was weeks away from its worst fiasco in the entire Troubles. This is the story of how the IRA was penetrated by British intelligence, a covert war that played out in the shadows with far-reaching consequences. This is the story of the secret intelligence war against the IRA. In May 1987, the Irish Republican Army placed a £400 bomb in a boat and moved it secretly across Lough Neagh in the very centre of Northern Ireland, and then up the River Blackwater to be delivered to one of the IRA's most dangerous units. The East Tyrone Brigade of the IRA was recognised by the British security forces as a deadly enemy. In 1987, it was led by Patrick Kelly.
Did you know that he had joined the IRA?
Absolutely not, no. Patrick would have been of the belief that that is something that, first of all, didn't need to be said. I know that Patrick had a love for his country and he aspired to a united Ireland, and I think that would be a fair assessment, that we all would have that belief that, you know, the British didn't have any right to rule part of our country.
Kelly commanded a group of experienced gunmen and bombers like Jim Lina.
Jim led from the front, you know. Jim had the qualities and the caliber to take things where a lot of people wanted him to go, which was to win.
Libyan arms shipments had given the IRA more weapons than at any time in their history, and Kelly and Lina were putting them to use.
The red Renault van commandeered by the IRA gang was unrecognisable. It had carried 500 pounds of explosive.
In May 1987, their target was a police station in the village of Loughgall.
The Provisional IRA team that were there that night were responsible for possibly dozens of murders. This was a very ruthless group of individuals who brought a great deal of misery and despair to many families.
That evening, members of Britain's elite special forces, the SAS, were lying in wait.
The police say a massive bomb was driven to the gates on a mechanical digger. They say terrorists fired first and the security forces responded. The bodies of some of the dead could clearly be seen sometime after the gun battle.
It appears Patrick Kelly took up position and opened fire on the police station. The weapon he had with him discharged 18 rounds, and where he fell on being shot was at the front of the van, opposite the police station. It would appear in the case of Jim Lynagh, he's made an effort to get into the back of the van, and he's got partially into the back of the van.
9 people were dead, 1 a civilian passerby shot by the SAS. The rest were members of the IRA, the entire unit that attacked Loughgall.
These men wouldn't have complained about what happened because they knew the risks they took. The goal that night was to ensure that none of these men left that scene alive.
The Loughgall ambush was the IRA's biggest loss of life in a single incident during the Troubles. IRA man John Crawley heard the news in jail.
I was in my cell, and reports that there's been an attack in Loughgall, and there's 8 killed, and there was a cheer in the jail because people thought it was Brits. Then the final news report, all terrorist killing operation. How was that even possible?
The Republican movement treated the men as martyrs. Colm Lynagh carried his brother Jim's coffin.
The men who died were, to me, all heroes. I suppose people are always devastated when they know somebody personally. But there was an outpouring of support, obviously, and you can see that reflected in the funerals.
Margaret Thatcher and all the other rich and powerful people will be sorry in their time that Loughgall ever happened.
But there was no disguising that the ambush was a disaster for the IRA.
What was the atmosphere like within the ranks of the IRA at the time?
Well, you know, anytime volunteers are wiped out like that, there's great despondency, you know, particularly I knew a few of them, and yeah, I was despondent as well, yeah.
The disaster for the IRA went well beyond the heavy death toll and the loss of one of its most formidable units. The real disaster was that the security forces knew about the attack long before it took place. The IRA's internal security had been fatally breached.
From a strategic point of view, I think it was devastating.
How did they know that, you know, Loughgall was going to be attacked?
The IRA dispatched their internal security unit, tasked with flushing out spies to investigate. But that only compounded the disaster. Because the man they sent to find out who betrayed their secrets was also working for their enemy. The IRA's main spy catcher was a senior, long-running spy for British intelligence. Freddie Scappaticci. For decades, he was one of Britain's best spies, deep inside the IRA, and at the same time, he was running IRA inquiries into security breaches, including the Loughgall ambush.
The inquiry, personally at this stage, I would have no confidence in any such inquiry given what we know about the infiltration of the IRA's own security apparatus.
After the ambush, the local IRA man assigned to the investigation was Gerard Hart. His brother Ignatius says he liaised with Scappaticci, codename Steak Knife.
Gerard would have been part of the investigation at Loughgall, and that I was told that he would have been going back to Steak Knife with all the information that was being collected and what happened at Loughgall. I'm sure Steak Knife was getting the full information, and that would have been relayed back to his handlers.
The Loughgall ambush underscored how vulnerable individual IRA units were without the advantage of surprise. But the aftermath demonstrated just how fundamentally the IRA as a whole was compromised by spies. From the earliest days of the Troubles, the IRA was constantly on alert for the enemy within. Consorting with police or the army was punished by public humiliation. But touting, passing information to the security forces, produced more savage punishments and frequently a death sentence. In some cases, suspected informers were secretly buried in remote areas, rendering them disappeared. In 1972, 21-year-old Dolores Price was a member of a secret IRA unit called the Unknowns. A unit she said was run by the IRA's commander in Belfast, Gerry Adams. The Unknowns made those accused of informing disappear. We have obtained a recording in which Dolores Price describes driving a number of people to their deaths. An interviewer asked her if the order to take them away always came from Gerry Adams.
Yeah, in that period, yeah. That was his daily, that was his thought. I never agreed with it. I remember arguing, I said, hey, hang on a minute. If you're talking about informers, the thing about killing an informer, there's two reasons. One is you cut off the information. Two is you make an example of them. I never, ever got to the bottom of why Gerry Adams brought that up. I never knew why.
Jean McConville, a widowed mother of 10, was abducted from her home in West Belfast at the end of 1972.
The children, I suppose they missed their mummy. Do they say anything about her at all?
They say every night. Some nights they say, I want to go, I want my mummy back. and then to go up to bed and start to pray for my mummy. Before I told them yesterday to keep our fingers crossed and pray hard for her coming back.
But they would never see their mother alive again.
Jean McConville was accused of giving the army information about the IRA. Dolores Price drove her to her execution.
We just called one night and Adams was down in a house down Falls Road and she had been arrested. She got into the car. As far as she was concerned, she was being taken away by the Legion of Mary to a place of safety. And that was unfortunate for her.
Jean McConville was shot a short distance from here and buried in a shallow grave.
It was over 30 years before her body was recovered and returned to her children. Gerry Adams has always denied being in the IRA and has said he played no act or part in Jean McConville's death or any of the disappeared, and that the allegation was part of a sustained, malicious, untruthful campaign against him. He declined to comment or cooperate with the BBC on this series, referring to other false and unsubstantiated allegations about him. The disappearance of suspected informers did not solve the IRA's problem with leaks. By the mid-1970s, the IRA's vulnerability had in fact escalated. Many had spilled the IRA's secrets inside the RUC's detention centre at Castlereagh in Belfast. Thousands of confessions were heard in its cells, often obtained, it was alleged, by beatings and torture. The IRA needed to reorganise into a tighter and more disciplined organisation. A seized IRA document revealed to the British a radical plan for a newly structured IRA. Gerry Adams was seen as one of its key architects.
Gerry Adams drew up a blueprint for a restructured IRA based on four-man cells, ASUs, active service units. These gave improved security. They were independent, separated by cut-offs, and far harder to penetrate by our own informers.
The IRA's new rules adhered to a core principle: maintain silence. IRA members arrested were no longer allowed to even speak to their police interrogators.
The IRA set up a dedicated team to enforce the rules and root out informers. The internal security unit was modelled on the unknowns. To minimise leaks, IRA members at the front line were regrouped into smaller, tighter cells called active service units.
Cell system. It was supposed to allow for efficiency. It was supposed to protect one unit from knowing the identity of the other. It was supposed to create autonomous units which would be impervious to knowledge, surveillance, information being gathered about their activities.
Adams and his ally Martin McGuinness were now at the helm of what was intended to be a tighter, more disciplined IRA, ready for a long war against Britain. Almost immediately, IRA operations intensified. Their East Tyrone Brigade, which included the young Jim Lina and Patrick Kelly, was particularly ruthless.
So what have you got to show me?
That was my UDR identification, which I carried.
Glenn Espy was a member of the Ulster Defence Regiment, a unit of the British Army recruited only within Northern Ireland.
Jennifer, that was the authority from 8 UDR to carry a .22 Walther pistol, and you can see it stamped and signed by the Colonel, and you can see the date stamp on it there. Headquarters, 8th County Tyrone Battalion, the Ulster Defence Regiment, 28th of August 1977.
At the end of the 1970s, the UDR had been pushed forward into the front line against the IRA. Glenn Espy was facing an enemy that was close to his home in Tyrone.
East Tyrone, before Loughgall, was a very well-oiled killing machine. When I say killing machine, killing people like me who were off-duty soldiers, soft targets.
Glenn Espy wasn't just a UDR soldier, he was also a plumber. One day in 1978, he was called out to a house, but it was an IRA trap.
This figure stepped out from the bathroom. The first thing I seen was this balaclava mask, and I have to say, I just stopped in my tracks. On his hand, he had a pistol and a two-handed military grip. He fired the pistol, it was a massive bang. The round struck me in the chest just below the nipple and projected me right down the hallway. It was actually like a kick from a horse. I finished up sitting on my backside against the open door, looking up at the gunman. The gunman stepped forward, and as I looked into the eyes of my murderer, the eyes showed absolutely no emotion, and I started running up to get round the side of this house. The gunman came out to the door and fired after me. I could hear the bang, poof, 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 and the rounds going by my head, and then I was hit in the left shoulder. The blood was coming from my mouth, and I ran across through this next hedgerow.
Pursued by the gunman, Glenn Espy took refuge in an empty house where he phoned for help. His attacker was never arrested, but Glenn Espy was lucky. Others weren't. That year alone, 9 UDR men were killed by the IRA. Months later, Margaret Thatcher entered Downing Street. An early Northern Ireland security briefing gave her a bleak assessment of the fight against the IRA.
Given to me in 4 kill. Don't you think it looks very nice?
What was your impression of the morale in 4?
She was told that the police and army agreed that the IRA's new cell structure was impossible to penetrate.
In conjunction with security forces and whatnot.
In response, Mrs. Thatcher decided the British also needed to reorganise. If the IRA was bedding in for a long war, British intelligence was gearing up to fight it too.
Cover them for here.
The professional she chose was the model for Alec Guinness's portrayal of fictional spy George Smiley. Maurice Oldfield, a former head of MI6 and veteran Cold War spy. In Belfast, Oldfield liaised with David Ramsbottom, the senior general in the city at the time.
I always remember we invited him home on Boxing Day, and it's my wife's birthday, and we always play charades at the time, and he drew the spy who came in from the cold, and he merely walked in and pointed his finger at his chest.
Oldfield's stay in Northern Ireland was brief but influential. His team ultimately redrew Britain's security strategy. They analysed individual IRA units like East Tyrone, concluding in their case that the only effective attack was likely to be based on sensitive intelligence and the use of covert forces. That combination of intelligence and covert forces would be the sharp end of the state's fight against the IRA for the next decade and more. As the British reorganised, the IRA's internal security unit unleashed its reign of terror. In a 2-year period beginning May 1980, more IRA members were killed by the IRA's own internal security than by the police and army. Because they usually shot their victims in the head, the internal security unit became known as the Nutting Squad. Suspected informers were no longer disappeared. The Nutting Squad made their fate a public spectacle.
I think they were probably generally feared. And whether known or unknown to the leadership, and I suspect it was known, they engaged in torture and things that are supposed to be forbidden by the IRA.
Crucially, the rules of the IRA's new cell structure did not apply to the internal security unit. It had access to every part of the IRA.
In retrospect, it's very obvious. The British would have been rubbing their hands in glee when the unit was formed and thinking, look, we've just got to get into these guys and find out their weaknesses, find out everything about them and turn a couple of them.
I had known Freddie Scappaticci from a pretty young age. I suppose I looked up to him, but I also know that he was a pretty ruthless character.
Freddie Scappaticci had been a British intelligence agent even before he became part of the IRA's internal security unit. Codename Steak Knife.
The famous steak knife was handed on to me in 1978 as being an important person. He was obviously someone who had access to the higher levels of the IRA.
Freddie Scappaticci had access to every IRA department. He even vetted new IRA recruits. But crucially, his involvement in IRA investigations gave him a unique insight because he could find out who had been involved in operations, as well as the identity of key operators in each area. In short, he could work out the IRA's strengths and weaknesses.
He would not have been consulted about or told about operations in advance, but he knew who the players were. And this was a sort of the Clapham junction of the IRA. Everything had to go through it.
Scappaticci was handled by an elite military intelligence unit based at Thiepval Barracks in Northern Ireland. The Force Research Unit, the FRU, so named because research was the Army's code word for agent handling.
We've seen several different guerrilla groups operate in this country, and we've seen what damage and fear they can bring into the country.
Patrick Mercer, seen here as a young cadet in Sandhurst, worked alongside it.
I would say that as a military agency, they were by far and away the most successful thing that we managed to achieve inside Northern Ireland.
For centuries, the British had been recruiting informers and running agents in the ranks of their enemies.
There's nothing new about the Force Research Unit. British military intelligence has been using this operation probably since Marlborough's time, but it was carried, I think, to its high point of its career in the fight in Northern Ireland.
Alongside the Army's FRU, two other British agencies were running spies in the IRA, including the Police Special Branch and the Security Service, MI5.
But it wasn't always clear whether they were fighting a war or fighting crime, trying to arrest members of the IRA or kill them on active service.
On that occasion, a gang of 3 known IRA men were shot dead.
2 of those suspected of being responsible for that bomb and another suspected terrorist were shot dead by the police.
When police appeared to have used intelligence to kill those suspected of terrorism in 3 separate incidents, the rule of law was broken.
The men were unarmed. So too was a 17-year-old youth, Michael Tye, shot in a Haitian...
A fact uncovered by Greater Manchester policeman John Stalker. His report into the so-called shoot-to-kill scandal and a follow-up by another English police officer are still closely guarded state secrets more than 30 years after they were written. We've obtained those reports.
These are the executive summaries, and it's easy to see why they've been kept secret for so long. They portray a massive cover-up by the guardians of the law, one in which police officers were instructed to lie to detectives and prosecutors, and in which senior police and MI5 officers destroyed evidence, all in the name of protecting an informer and other intelligence sources.
Both reports recommended prosecutions of members of the police and MI5. But it was decided that pursuing those cases in court would run contrary to the interests of national security. Intelligence could not provide a legal basis for killing suspects. Nor, as it turned out, could it be relied upon to stand up in court as evidence? In the 1980s, the IRA faced a major problem when hundreds of suspects were arrested and effectively interned.
The police were acting on information from insiders they referred to as converted terrorists. On the streets, they were known as supergrasses.
In 1983, the IRA killed a law lecturer a few weeks after he defended the scheme.
An informer or a supergrass is the ideal weapon for breaking open organised crime.
Edgar Graham, who was also a unionist politician, was shot on the street outside his university.
We've obtained an intelligence summary from the time.
It gives no evidence but sheds light on how some understood the IRA to operate, and says knowledge of the operation would have been restricted and cleared at the highest level, almost certainly by Adams. The man who would lead the ill-fated IRA attack on Loughgall spent 15 months in jail on the word of supergrass Pat McGurk. But Patrick Kelly and many others were released as it became clear that the system could not survive the scrutiny of judges.
Now, if Mr. McGurk were to return to the Dungannon area, would he have anything to fear from the Republican movement now?
He wouldn't have anything to fear from anybody because Pat McGurk is not at fault. It's RUC that's at fault because RUC have pressurised Pat McGurk into this here.
Intelligence could not stand up as evidence in court any more than it could justify the shooting to kill of suspects within the rule of law. But it could be used to ambush IRA active service units in the act. And to do that, the intelligence services needed exceptionally well-placed agents inside the IRA. By the mid-1980s, Freddie Scappaticci was a senior member of the Internal Security Unit. He was secretly recorded describing his interrogation techniques in the 1990s.
The standard procedure is to strip them and debug them, right, just to see if they're wired up or whatever, right? And usually put a boiler suit on them then after that, right? Put them in a chair facing the wall, right, and then go from there. Maybe the room's cold, they make you all sorts of promises, and they think they're going to go home, but they don't.
The fear created by the interrogation was based on the horror of the outcome.
Informers are very, very unpopular people, and the Irish Republican people would believe that it's quite acceptable for the IRA to take the life of anyone who is in the pay of the British Crown.
But in this case, is it not the case that Irishmen have in fact murdered another Irishman?
Well, I don't see it as murder.
The big question is, was a British agent allowed to murder other agents of the state in order to protect his standing and reputation within the IRA? Scappaticci and other agents were operating in a legal twilight, breaking the law supposedly to support the law.
There was a long process of waking up to the need to regulate by law people who, almost by definition, would be involved in either criminal activity or on the fringes or indeed at the centre of terrorist activity. It was assumed that the rules governing participating informants in the criminal sphere would suffice to deal with agents informants acting in the terrorist context, and it clearly wasn't sufficient.
Mrs. Thatcher's government was alerted to the legal minefield of agents who were on the state's payroll, but who also had blood on their hands. In 1986, Raymond White, then a senior police special branch officer, personally asked the Prime Minister for legal clarity on the running of agents in paramilitary organisations like the IRA.
I just took the opportunity of saying that what we were engaging in was in this grey area that hadn't been legislated for in the management of any agent. You were asking that individual, as it were, to act as a model terrorist and, as I say, do whatever the terrorist leadership was basically asking them to do. It was just totally uncharted territory, and we had a 10-minute conversation about that. And the message at the end of the day, I think it came back was more or less, well, carry on doing what you're doing, but don't get yourself caught.
The IRA's killing of informers went on.
Charlie McElmurray's body was found in this van on Sunday. He'd been tortured and shot in the head, branded an informer by the IRA.
I think that Mr. McElmurray, like anyone else living in West Belfast, knows that the consequence for informing is death.
In June 1993, Scappaticci's unit closed in on another victim. Joseph Mulhern was killed as an informer by the IRA, a brutal warning to the Republican community of the consequences of talking to the security forces. The intention was not just to warn, but to terrify. A message Scappaticci delivered in person to Joseph Mulhern's father.
It wasn't long after I'd buried my son. It was a warm day, and I heard a car pulling up behind me, and Scap get out. And I came over, shook hands, asked how things were. I knew that he would have been there, and I asked how he died. He said that the first shot had hit him in the back of the neck, and he shouted at the guy who'd shot him to shoot him again. So apparently the second shot hit him in the back of the head. That's something I never knew. He said that he was up with my son the night before he was shot. He would obviously have had to report that to his handlers.
In the second half of the 1980s, the IRA was being seriously hampered by informers, but still on the attack. Patrick Kelly's IRA unit in East Tyrone was one of those leading the campaign. In the midst of the IRA's new offensive, Glen Espy was attacked again.
Was enforced just about to change into second when I seen a green Ford Orion coming out of the end of the lane. I could see three men clearly wearing balaclava masks, and I meant, God, not again.
The ambush took place on the Koch Road just after 8 o'clock this morning. The part-time soldier was leaving his home for work when gunmen opened fire.
Two men come up armed with G3 assault rifles, firing over the car. The car was starting to vibrate as the first rounds hit round the car. I'd hear the rounds going by, and I was shot through the wrist. I ducked behind the book lid and ran across and jumped into the shuck here. The guy with the G3 at the front, he just came around. I thought, Jesus, this man had killed before, and he was there to kill me. I was caught in his killing ground, and he wasn't going to let me go.
The weapon aimed at Glenn Espy had already been used to murder 2 UDR soldiers. It was recovered 7 weeks later from the IRA unit at Loughgall.
The weapon that was used was a G3 that was traced, and I was told by the intelligence people that was the personal weapon of the commander of East Tyrone PIRA.
That was Patrick Kelly at the time.
That's who was the commander of East Tyrone PIRA. Maybe 3 months after it, when I came home from hospital and I looked into the back seat, and the 2 children were down where you put your feet. And I mind looking into Sharon and Len and says, "What are you doing down there?" He says, "Daddy, in case the bad men shoot at the car." And I turned around and I literally burst out crying. I thought, sorry, what am I putting my children through? Because I can do this, but fuck me, look what I'm putting my children through. And after that, I made a decision then to sail up and move to the east of the province.
By that time, the security forces had found a way to penetrate the IRA in East Tyrone. Surveillance was key. This is actual footage from secret army cameras used to monitor IRA suspects in Tyrone several years after Loughgall. These pictures have never been shown on television before. The IRA unit that attacked Loughgall was under the same kind of surveillance weeks before the ambush.
By April 1987, the police knew the IRA was planning to attack a police station. What's more, at least 10 days beforehand, they knew the intended target was Loughgall.
The IRA lost a generation of their men in the Loughgall ambush. Their investigation did not find an informer. According to Republican sources, local IRA man Gerard Hart and Scappaticci fell out over who may have been to blame. Hart returned to the IRA's front line, what they called active service.
I was told that Gerard had been asked to leave the role he had as internal security and go back on active service.
The IRA in Tyrone was not finished. They killed 8 soldiers in a bombing a year after Loughgall, but they were fatally exposed to the SAS. In all, 26 members of the IRA in County Tyrone were killed by the SAS. Gerard Hart was among them, killed along with his brother Martin and their brother-in-law Brian Mullen while carrying out an IRA attack.
An army helicopter landed, 4 plainclothes men got into it and were flown away from the scene. It has all the hallmarks of an SAS operation.
Do you specifically hold Freddie Scappaticci in some way responsible?
The reality of it is, if Freddie Scappaticci was dealing with internal security in Tyrone, which we now know he was, there's obviously that was a leading role, how so many operations were carried out in Tyrone. Sad. Very sad. But it was a dirty war. All wars are dirty, but this was an exceptionally dirty war.
The attrition rate was just so appalling. You know, the SAS, you know, the British intelligence services are obviously, you know, in a position to intercept most operations. It was absolutely clear that we were losing if we hadn't already lost the war, and you know, that it was time to cash in the chips.
The IRA was infiltrated at an operational and tactical level, but other agents were being used for strategic purposes. Agents of influence had been placed or recruited to help steer the longer-term direction of the IRA and the Republican movement.
During the clashes with police at the Belfast funeral of IRA commander Larry Marley in April 1987, Freddie Scappaticci played his Republican role to perfection. But he wasn't the only spy hiding in plain sight. There was also Roy McShane. He became a driver for Gerry Adams, but Sinn Féin later identified him as a police special branch agent. And Dennis Donaldson, a key Gerry Adams ally and a British intelligence agent. Years later, he admitted that he had been spying on the IRA for 2 decades.
I was recruited in the 1980s after compromising myself during a vulnerable time in my life. Since then, I have worked for British intelligence and the RUC PSNI Special Branch. Over that period, I was paid money.
Donaldson was a trusted strategist inside the Republican movement, which increased his currency to his MI5 spy masters.
As an agent of influence, Dennis Donaldson's key value was the subtle influence he could bring to bear when key decisions were being taken at the top of the IRA and Sinn Féin. As the years progressed, MI5 shared his inside information directly with Downing Street.
The demonstrable agent of influence was Dennis Donaldson, who went out pushing the peace process line, undermining anybody that asked questions, pushing the Adams line.
MI5 had long placed agents of influence inside the IRA and Republican movement.
They encouraged ideas that were more of a political desire as opposed to a military desire. They raised suspicions about the abilities of certain people, and that brought about change. The intelligence world, as I say, played an immense part in bringing about, shall we say, a realization within the Provisional IRA that they had passed the post in terms of the armed conflict.
The targets of that campaign of influence included members of the IRA Army Council, who directed the IRA's campaign.
As a counterintelligence strategy, was it important that the Army Council and its membership, although fluid, remained generally intact so that those individuals or people close to those individuals could be targeted for recruitment?
The Army Council was made up of people who, shall we say, of varying abilities, of varying influence. And once you knew those abilities and influences, then obviously those that sort of moved in their midst or, as I say, attended to their needs or were able to sort of make commentary in their presence, as I say. All those things had a collective influence, shall we say, over a period of time.
Freddie Scappaticci strongly denied being a British agent, then effectively disappeared. A court order prevents us from finding him or speaking to him. Republicans call him a traitor. The army called him their golden egg. The lawfulness of his activities has never yet come before a court. The scale of the intelligence war only became apparent at the close of the Troubles. Castlereagh, where IRA members spilled secrets in the 70s, gave up its own secrets in 2002. In March that year, the IRA broke in.
The raid at Castlereagh was stunning. 3 men got past all the security checks there on Sunday night, took documents from the Special Branch office and walked out.
Dozens of highly sensitive documents were stolen, including the code names of Belfast-based paramilitary agents.
It was a unique event in one way. As far as I know, the Castlereagh break-in was the only successful attempt to break into our intelligence system. Well, the RUC's.
But the IRA did not act on the information.
As we all know, and we think we know why, don't we, it was never put to use, the stuff. And was that because it was actually too hot to handle by then for the provisional leadership?
It suits intelligence agencies to let their enemies believe they have been compromised. But security and Republican sources have told us that the Castlereagh break-in exposed so many agents that it posed an impossible question. How could they kill them all? IRA figures at every level of the organisation sold IRA secrets to British intelligence. The taboo for the IRA and the Republican movement is not only the identity of some of the informers and agents, but also the question: did agents of the state, spies within their own ranks, bring the IRA in from the cold?